Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, good to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you today, Dr. Paul.
Good. Let's talk about our favorite subject because it keeps the world together. Everybody loves the Fed because they know how to print money and everybody wants more money and they get their answers. But right now there's a little bit of annoyance about this thing because I've always said, yeah, getting the money is one thing, but getting value with your money, that's the big question. So there's a lot of money out there, and no matter who wants it, they seem to be getting it. The checks rolled out this week to the tune of billions of dollars. Every family, I've had people come up to me, why did I get this check? I'm employed. I have a pretty good income. And here they've sent me these checks. So it's continuous, and it wouldn't ever be political. But it's something that continues, and they just think that all you have to do is print the money and everything is going to be all right. But they're getting a little bit nervous because this whole idea of watching for the purchasing power of the dollar, I claim that the only solution is going to be not with us doing the right thing in Washington, but eventually it'll be the liquidation of debt because we can't handle it. But the government's never going to slow up on spending, balance the budget, and pay down debt. That'll never happen. But what can happen is the debt has to be lowered. It has to be liquidated. And if you have total runaway inflation, you liquidate the whole debt. You just hand them out pieces of paper and say, oh, your debt's been paid. And this week we had a hint that maybe that's where we are going because in spite of the fact that the warning signs have been around for 10 years that something big is going on when it comes to the inflation was a significant factor. And when I talk about inflation, that means the Fed printing the money to take care of the Congress and other people. So if inflation was continuing, but then we had this crazy thing called lockdown for this virus that turned out to be not nearly as bad as the lockdown. The virus wasn't anything compared to the damage done economically. And even the Fed now works the two together. Well, we have the problem with the monetary system and the deficit and all this, but we really had this lockdown really mess things up. And he's admitting a truth there because this lockdown has a lot to do with this disorganization. Inflation and distortion with the monetary system and interest rates will unhinge the economy itself. Economic planning finally gets unhinged. But in this case, we've had this additional lockdown. And then when they finally do come back and say, well, we have an economic growth again, economic growth, come on back to work, everybody. And nobody shows up. And then they wonder why you can't transport goods. And there's still a lot of questions raised. But there's a lot of dollars floating around. And when this has been brought to the attention of the Fed in this past several months now, yeah, it's showing up. CPI is going up and the PPI is going up. We have to be concerned. There is a debt and they're spending a lot of money. So we have to be concerned. But this is just transitory. It's just short-lived. It's because we're just coming back from the lockdown of COVID, and that's all getting better. Yeah, sure, a little bit, but we have to cross our fingers on that. So he said, so the Fed, up until very recently, it was total reinsurance. Transitory, it's going to go away. But if inflation does eventually go away, but not because the Fed says so, and they're incapable of doing it because every time they test the waters for cutting back a little bit, not really cutting back as much as inflating less rapidly, and it doesn't work. There's hysterics in the market. They tried that in the fall of 2019, and overnight rates shot up to 10%, so they had to back off when they made a feeble attempt to shrink the balance sheet. So they have really no tools other than their gabbing and convincing people, and the markets respond pretty well because when the Fed announces a policy, the banks are happy and the stock market seems to be happy no matter what you do. But that just means to me that the system now tolerates a bigger bubble than ever before, probably bigger than ever seen in all of history. So, Chris, we do have a bunch of people who thinks that it's transitory, but more and more now they know that is just a lot of malarkey. This is not transitory. This is impossible to solve without some real solutions, which means that there will be a penalty for it. And one thing that I try to emphasize is that any individual, company, corporation, country, or whoever, if you live way beyond your means, you will be forced eventually to live beneath your means. And that is known in individuals like that. If they get too much debt and the bank won't loan them any more money again, eventually their standard of living goes down. And you say, well, no, with the Fed, they keep printing money. Yes, they will do that, and they'll get away with it, and some will be able to rig it more in their favor. But eventually, the telltale sign of this thing not working so well anymore is the cost of living goes up, and the value of the money goes down. Chris, I think we're entering an era right now is going to get much worse before the people and our so-called leadership in Washington wake up and decide maybe there is an answer, and it's not found in Keynesian inflationism.
Very good, Dr. Paul, and you are correct. Inflation is transitory in the same way that 15 days will flatten the curve. So you can think of it that way. And, even though they are bankers, members of the Fed, you could treat them like politicians. What they say makes headlines every week, but it means very little. I mean, think of all the bubbles that you may have lived through, and the longer one has been here, the more bubbles. I know I've been through my share of them, all the bubbles and busts that the Fed creates. Think back of how many times the Fed chairman went on TV and said, you know what, you should really sell now. Now's the time for you to sell. Never. And how many times have you heard, someone say, yeah, I was watching the Fed chairman the other day and I took his word and now I'm financially independent. Again, you will never hear that because the Fed is not our financial advisor. It is a marriage of the banking industry and the government. So it's the same old story of corporations married to the government. We have the pharma, we have the military, we have the media, but the Fed is the worst of them all because they make all the others possible. The Fed is not there for us. What they do is they redistribute wealth from the middle class, the upper middle class, from the poor, all the way up. So they pickpocket everybody. So what they say means nothing. You have to look at what they do. And as Dr. Paul pointed out, they are printing like crazy. So inflation is not transitory. It's going to be with us, and the prices will reflect it.
And one thing we can be sure of, the numbers and the information we get from our government and our Federal Reserve will be fudged figures. They're not going to be reliable. But even understanding that, if we look at what we heard about this week, they're still really pretty bad. They change the way they count. They use core numbers. That means they exclude certain things from the CPI, and they make it sound a little bit better. But even these numbers, I want to go over a couple of those numbers that were reported this week. And the first one was the CPI. It went up in June at 0.9%. So that's over 10% in a year. Well, that used to be considered significant price inflation. Prices are going up pretty fast, but that's the core inflation, and that's high. It's going to get a lot higher, and it's already high enough. They're just reporting it differently. But if you go to the PPI, the Producer Price Index, which is in a way a prediction. When they're producing goods, we can look at prices, and this will be translated in consumer prices down the road. The exact time, you don't know, it depends on the product, but it could be in 6 months or a year. Some of these producer prices that are going up will be translated into consumer prices later on. But that was even worse than the consumer prices. It went up 1% in June, so that's 12% in a year rate. So the numbers are bad. But then again, if you look at it, we've already, and Chris has mentioned too, they've been printing like crazy. If you look at the M1 figures, we're increasing the M1 number at 20% per year. So that's a big time. That's debasing a currency rather rapidly, but nobody seems to be too worried about it. But I think the reports that came out and the testimonies by Powell this week indicates that if you could read carefully, he's starting to be more worried than he was willing to admit before. And I might read a quote from him in a minute. But the amount of money, which is really the incentive to get us into this trouble, was the amount of spending what we have, trillions and trillions of dollars, and most of it didn't even have to go through the Congress. Most of it is just, propping up the banking system. So they, in the last year, it was over $6 trillion that they created, but so much of that was just sort of monetized by the Fed because they keep buying the Treasury bills and they keep buying mortgage-backed security, and they say, well, houses are doing okay again. Well, there was a rush because interest rates were so desperately low, but that's not the end of it all, because what happens when there seems to be a buying spree and people say, oh, the price is going up, I think it's time to buy, that's not a good measurement of the marketplace, and that's the reason why government planning never works. They don't know how big the market, even the people providing for the market, they don't know. They should have indicators like the interest rates. See, a real interest rate gives you a hint on what you should do, whether you should be buying a house or borrowing or saving and this sort of thing. So the most important price in an economy is the price of money, the interest rate. But that is absolutely absent. There's no way that you can get any information on that to help make a decision. The whole thing is that people are willing, to sort of sit back and take their check and say it's all going to be okay. But this system has been around a long time. It didn't happen since COVID. It didn't happen since Powell was put in office. And we do know the history pretty well, which we can't go over right now. But a major event occurred in 1913, just creating this monster, the Federal Reserve, has been around, and it gets worse and worse over the years, to the point where we have this staggering debt and a staggering dependency on so many programs. It's the military welfare state that is dependent on it. So you wonder how did this happen? Did Congress decide to spend money and decide, well, we need somebody to monetize the debt, so we'll create the Fed? Or was the Fed there and they've been created for other reasons? Then all of a sudden there's a symbiosis, and they go and the Congress starts spending. And I think it's both. The Congress spends the money, and they know the Fed will, no matter what the Fed says, the Fed will accommodate. And they pretend not to, because I think even the Fed must be a bit surprised they're getting away with what they're doing. But they're going to be shocked when the real information comes back. Matter of fact, Powell has already expressed that, it's a little bit more inflation, he's talking about prices, than we really anticipated. And there was one statement in this week's testimony, I think it was before the Senate. Powell said something that it sort of reflects that I don't think he was seeking truth as much as truth was blurted out. And his quote was, when they were asking him about, how to handle this and what they should do, he says, well, we're humble about what we understand. We're trying to understand both the base case and also the risk. And I would think that's an understatement of the year, that somewhat understand they ought to be humble about it, because they just can't know this. And this is the whole thing about Austrian economics. That's why we're against economic planning, because we can't know what the demands are and what the prices would be. That's why wages and price controls always fail, because nobody can anticipate, and that's why socialism always fails, and that's why some countries are in such bad shape as they are now. And we're getting in worse shape all the time because there's been such a gross distortion of the market. And I always get a bit annoyed when we lecture other countries, not that they don't deserve some criticism, but when we lecture them either on economic matters, or if we lecture them on civil libertarian matters. Oh, such and such country, you know what they do? They have all these kind of infractions of liberties on their citizens. And then they say, but nobody ever asks them, and they never have to explain, well, why do you have these people in solitary confinement? Because they were spectators at and went in the Capitol. A rowdy bunch of people, and then they are in prison and without charges being made. And we have we have the audacity to criticize other countries for not following civil liberties. I think we need more Edward Snowdens around to explain how the government is so abusive of our civil liberties, because all this economic stuff we talk about is involved with civil liberties too, because it's a violation of liberty when you steal from people, and that's what inflation is all about. It's literally theft. And the founders thought if you counterfeited the money, you deserved the death penalty. And that's what we're living with, but we have a nation that's been conditioned to go along with it. And our schools have taught that inflation is good, print the money, deficits don't matter. And they were also, the people were also conditioned, for accepting the authoritarianism of why lockdown is good. That's how we take care of medical problems. So that's collective medical practice, and it's turned out to be a disaster.
Yeah, Dr. Paul, and boy, are you correct. Inflation is theft. Our founders recognized that. It was a severe punishment for doing it. But as you pointed out, in 1913, an institution was created to legally be able to do these things. And as we say in our title, it has been 50 years from Nixon to Biden. And I consider that the extreme period of the trend. We are living in the extreme times, which is what happens with manias. They always hit their blow off top. Now, when that exactly will be, who knows? But one thing we can say is that both parties were involved in this. All the presidents were involved in this over the last 50 years. It's a shame to say that President Trump, one of his major errors was in promoting government spending and Fed inflation, record breaking, and that goes down to Reagan, the Bushes. It's been continuous, not even a hint of a pullback. Both parties are trapped in these big government, big inflation ideas that are a 50-year failure, and they can't stop. They have to keep going, as Dr. Paul said. And if, let's say, I use this analogy a lot, but if I'm drinking and I say I want to sober up, but I don't stop, I keep putting more drinks and more, you'd say to yourself, whoa, that's a bad idea. Your ideas are wrong. That's what we see with this financial system. It's all wrong, and they're not going to stop it. Supply and demand will stop it. Economic law will stop it. Will have to be defaults. And when that happens, it's going to be very painful, because there are a lot of people out there that are living with illusions of what the government is and that they take care of them, and those illusions are going to be shattered. So there needs to be a lot of good people out there to be able to explain the road that we have to take to fix things up again.
Very good, Chris. And Chris gave us some history dates there, but very briefly go over those again. 1913, of course, was the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. 1933 is when FDR stole all the gold from the people, then devalued and made the gold go from $20 up to $35 an ounce. And the American people weren't allowed to own gold up until 1975. So in a way, 1975 was a brief helpful direction, going in the right direction. Of course, if the government has a control of a market, it's less valuable. But still, it was a positive move to allow the American people to own gold once again. But 1971 was, a time when it was the breakdown of the Bretton Woods, where foreigners couldn't even, be reimbursed for their dollars with gold. And that turned the whole world into a fiat system. And so the real big problems have been building from 71. And it is a way they have subsidized the welfare warfare. And that's why the deficits are so huge. So the most recent date that I think is significant but rarely mentioned, I might have already mentioned it once today, and that is September 17th of 2019. And that was when, during the night, the overseas night rate, banks borrowing from each other to pay off the temporary borrowing that they are making, that those interest rates are rigged, and they're kept down around 1%, and it's all to take care of the banks. It's all fiction. But there was a shortage of credit during that one night on September 17th, and the overnight rates went up to 10%. And this was panic time. But the Fed did. It came in and rescued and created billions and billions of dollars. But it was also a sign that their efforts to shrink the balance sheet, we have to give up on this. They're not going to respond to this favorably. And that's where they are now. They can't even suggest shrinking the balance sheet. They can't even suggest cutting one nickel out of the budget. They can't ever for a minute think about, why don't we change our foreign policy where we're not in 130 countries? Why do they ever think about looking for people to send checks to like they're doing now, and bribing them so they don't go to work and make more confusion? So it's a extreme mess. And so the next day is going to be when this stuff essentially stops functioning. The panic is so great and people rush out of dollars. And you say, no, dollar's good. Relatively speaking, it's good because everything else looks so bad. But even the dollar in those terms has gone down as well. But there will be a day then where there will be a panic. And I'll tell you what, there's certain people in office now, and there's a lot more people now that aren't even frightened about, supporting the wokeism movement, which is actually part of the cultural Marxist movement. And the one characteristic of that, as I look at it, is the most damaging thing about wokeism and cultural Marxism is they do not believe there is such a thing as truth. Truth does not exist. You can't have a right or a wrong or a good or a bad. You can't say there's a good money and a bad money. You can't say counterfeiting is bad or good. It is the government or the political party that makes all those decisions. And it was tried in the 20th century with a total failure. And where it's been tried right now, it's failing like never before. And yet we're set, and we have so many people now that endorse that. No matter what they talk about, freedom and all this, they don't have a good grasp of what it is like for people to own their lives and make their own decision. To me, it's not complicated. It's allowing people to do things in a voluntary way. Everything should be voluntary. All social and economic associations should be voluntary, and nobody's allowed to initiate aggression. That's really the only two rules. Which, if you say, well, that is based on a truth that it's better not to kill people than endorse wholesale murder. But right now, we have a large number of people that are saying, well, we shouldn't have that. That's too much trouble. And that's why you hear this nonsense coming out of Washington about what you can do. And is there any more lying than ever before? Just think of lying over the elections. It's so confusing. And I don't think, right now, I think it's obvious that one party's doing more than the other. But I think lying has been bipartisan. And I think people do this in different manners. But I think that's a basic moral principle. If it isn't corrected, we're not going to do very well. And I think it was, John Adams that said, if morality doesn't exist in a country that has a constitution as they had written, he says, it won't work. Well, I think the morality is gone and the Constitution is hanging by a thread.
Fortunately, I will finish up trying to look at on a positive side here. And one positive thing that everybody could always keep with them is that central planning always fails. And technology will make no difference whatsoever. Doesn't matter what technology you have. You could take technology and apply it to like natural resources, water, copper, lumber, and those natural resources, put them in the same environment, will work the exact same way every time. But natural resources do not have free will. They do not choose. They do not have their own goals. They do not think. They are not human beings. Central planners think, oh, well, we could do this with all these natural resources. Let's do it with people too. That's where that's their major mistake all the time. You have a planet of 7 billion people, all with their own free will, their own values, goals, and choices that they make in every second, which makes people naturally unpredictable. And, we have amazing technology, and you may think to yourself, no, look, they know this about you. They know that when you wake up at 7 in the morning, you always check the weather. But that's that's the past. That says nothing. If you do that 10 days straight, that says nothing about day 11. On day 11, you may sleep in. You may rush out of the house, a few hours early, and you don't check the weather. People are unpredictable. The best you can do with people is probabilities. And you cannot centrally plan a world with 7 billion and infinite amount of probabilities, which is why they always fail. So we never have to worry about them actually succeeding. The problem is, while they try, they do tremendous damage to humanity. We're seeing it yet again, the damage that they're doing to, chasing these utopias of central planning. Fortunately, the ideas of liberty are always there, always available to spread. We're doing our part. We hope that you can also do yours.
Very, very good, Chris. The reports, and earlier on I read a quote from Powell showing that he does have concerns, but he also his business is reassuring the market. He's allowed to tell them a little bit, but not too much, and then reassure them, and it goes up and down and back and forth to confuse everybody, and they do a pretty good job. But the problem is it backfires. They're confused too, so they don't know what they're doing. But they have what they call a beige book that comes out 8 times a year, and it comes out shortly before the FOMC meets to talk about the serious matters of monetary policy. And the beige book is supposed to be, the intellectual setting, for the policy, and so it comes out. But this last time around, there was a little bit of a disagreement. The beige book was saying, it's not that, they didn't buy into this transitory stuff. It could be a lot longer. Then later on, then Powell comes back and said, this is a little bit more serious. So I think the whole thing is the one thing that in all this talking and everything that you hear from the officials, it's all about the technical aspects of where the interest rate should be and who should get the checks and who should be helped. But really what they don't want to deal with is, what if they said, which they accept, and they defend this position, there is no reason why you have to cut anything. And they don't. And that's where we are. So until they get serious about that, you can just depend on it moving in this direction to the point where there's a panic out of the dollar, which means that they're not going to go and buy other currencies as much as people are going to leave the dollar to buy stuff. That's why they're doing that now, and that's why there are shortages, because people are buying. And I had somebody tell me the other day, somebody was buying chlorine for a swimming pool. The last time he bought the chlorine, it was $50. Now it was $320. So it happens. The shortages will come, and there's a psychological factor to pricing. The government has no control over it. It's a subjective thing on what people will finally pay for something. So it'll be that subjective element that Keynesianism and socialism, they don't even pay any attention to this, because it means that individuals still will have the final answer, just like they did on the breakdown of Bretton Woods. That has lasted from 1945 up to 1971, but eventually the people who wanted to own gold said, this is total fiction. So eventually it breaks down, and that's what will happen here. This system that's held together very, very loosely, where it'll be announced when the people decide, we can't trust this, and we can't trust the politicians to tell us the truth, we can't trust the elections, and we certainly can't trust our money. Then we're going to get monetary reform. Then I hope we can participate in this and at least make some advice about what sound money might look like, and go in that direction. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.